Welcome, everyone. This is Heather Bradley with the Center for Nonprofit Resources in Toledo, Ohio. We're delighted to be partnering with the Toledo Bar Association to present this webinar. The Toledo Bar Association recently launched a pro bono initiative known as Nonprofit Connect to help connect local attorneys with our local nonprofits. And this presentation is made possible by one of those attorneys. The topic of today's webinar is Anatomy of a Charity. I will be monitoring questions you may have throughout the webinar. Please type your questions into the Q&A section, not in the chat box. We have time scheduled for the speaker to take questions towards the end of the webinar, and microphones are muted for participants throughout the presentation. A copy of the slides will be sent to you after the webinar. The last slide includes resources available through the center. This webinar is being recorded and a replay link will be emailed to you within 24 to 48 hours. Now it's my pleasure to introduce our guest speaker for today, Craig Burns. Craig is a local attorney here in Toledo. He's with Marshall and Melhorn and has been practicing since 1990. As a business lawyer, he has many areas of interest, which specifically includes nonprofit. So Craig, are you ready to take it away?
I am. Thank you, Heather. Today's topic, I've called it the anatomy of a charity. We're going to take a deeper look at what charities are, what they're about, and some of the big picture issues that address charities. The inevitable disclaimer, since I am a lawyer, this is generalized advice. It superficially covers a wide range of topics. It's necessarily oversimplified. In actual situations, the facts and circumstances can change the result radically. This is a good general guide, but don't take this as the advice you're going to rely on to do something big. And if there's a question, consult with competent legal counsel. So first, we're going to ask a kind of a philosophical question. What exactly is a charity? And you're thinking to yourself, why is he even asking this question? If I didn't already know what a charity is, why would I even be listening to this? But what I'd like to do today is explore exactly what we mean by a charity, by a nonprofit, some other terms, figure out exactly what those mean, because they're not exactly the same thing. And a lot of people use those terms kind of indistinctly. So there are many types of nonprofit organizations. Charities are just one type. Not all nonprofit organizations are charities. And then within charities, there's a subset called public charities. Not all charities are public charities. Some charities are private foundations and have some additional rules. And then finally, not all charities are corporations. If you're listening to this, you're probably involved with a charity that is a public charity and is a nonprofit corporation, but there are other possibilities as well. So in terms of the different types of nonprofit organizations, this is not at all an exclusive list, but the ones that you'll more commonly see, 501c3 charities, that's probably the organization that most of you are affiliated with. 501c4 is a social welfare organization. A social welfare organization is kind of a 501c3 light. It is not allowed to take tax-deductible contributions, but it doesn't pay tax on its income, and it accomplishes some type of social purpose. They were being repurposed for political purposes, and for that reason, 501c4s have in some ways a stricter regulatory regime than 501c3s right now. But we're not going to go deeply into what a C4 is. One of the examples of abuse, a few years ago up in Detroit, there was a former mayor of Detroit who had a 501c4 social welfare organization that was getting donations from a lot of people who wanted to do business with the city. And apparently the mayor was convicted of using that money for vacations and things. So there were some abuses with 501c4s. That's why they have a stricter regime now. Um, so they're pretty uncommon. And I think for that reason, IRS views them with a little more scrutiny than 501c3s. A 501c6 trade association, that's an organization set up to benefit members of a particular profession, especially in a particular region. So, for example, I belong to the Toledo Bar Association. That's a 501c6 trade association. So they're supposed to be made up of members in a particular profession, maybe even in a particular geographic region, and they undertake activities to promote that profession. Again, they can't take tax-exempt contributions, but they don't pay tax on their income as long as it's related to their function. 501c7 social clubs, the Elks Club, the American Legion, college fraternities, the possibly even the parents organization at your school. A lot of these are considered social clubs. They don't file, many of them are very small and don't even have to file a tax return. But again, they don't pay tax on their income, but you can't make a tax deductible contribution to one of those. Many cooperatives are nonprofits. They're nonprofits in the sense that they don't have, they have equity owners, but the profits are not distributed according to equity ownership. Typically, if you're a cooperative and a farm co-op or even a grocery co-op, I think REI, the outdoor store, was a cooperative for some time. I'm not sure if it still is. But rather than paying dividends, they pay patronage dividends. So if you belong to an elevator, a grain elevator, you probably own one share, and then when they determine what the profits are at the end of the year, they distribute them based on how much business you did with the elevator. So if you and your neighbor each have one share, you put 3 times as much grain through the elevator, then you get 3 times the distribution as your neighbor who didn't put through as much. So these are all nonprofits. So when we say nonprofit, we don't necessarily mean a charity. Only recognized 501c3 organizations are charities, and I put an asterisk there because the general rule is every charity has to be recognized by IRS as a charity. The exception are churches. Bona fide churches, because of the First Amendment to the Constitution, are not required to file a Form 1023 or file Form 990s. They're sort of exempt from government regulation because of the Establishment Clause in the Constitution. So why does it matter? Why do we care? As I said, only contributions to 501c3 charities can be tax deductible. Well, 501c3 charities and also governmental units. You could write a check to the federal government and claim a charitable deduction, or to your school, if it's a public school or private school, probably. But you can write you write a check to a public school if it is intended to be a contribution as opposed to fees or something like that. You can claim a tax deduction for that. But among nonprofit organizations, only the 501c3s can take tax deductible contributions. Only 501c3s and to some extent those 501c4 social welfare organizations we talked about a moment ago have charitable purposes. The 501c4 has a social welfare purpose, which is kind of a charity light, as I said, but 501c3s have charitable purposes. So a trade association, a social club, they don't have charitable purposes. They're allowed to promote the interests of their members and not the interest of the general public. It also matters because some grants and other programs require the applicant to have a 501c3 status. Sometimes grants want you to have a recognition letter from IRS saying you're a 501c3 that's a couple years old. They want to know they're dealing with a charity and not with, or even an established charity, and not an organization that someone just cooked up to try to get a grant. The And finally, for fundraising, I guess there are two aspects. One is if you're fundraising and you tell people their donations are tax deductible, and they are, then that's a benefit for fundraising. A lot of people want the tax deduction. With the recent tax reform in 2016 or so, that's less important. 2017, the tax bill, a lot more people are using their standard deductions, and for a lot of people, the charitable contribution doesn't do them any good on their taxes anymore. But still, the other reason is if you're giving money to a charity as opposed to just some random organization that may or may not be a charity, there's kind of an idea that 501c3 status is a stamp of approval, that it's at least met some minimum threshold to be a charity. Unlike, say, for example, the George Costanza Human Fund from Seinfeld. There was an episode of Seinfeld where George Costanza created the Human Fund, which was really just money for him. If you have 501c3 status, at least people know that you got IRS to agree that it looked like it might be on the level. So how can you verify that another organization, or that an organization is a 501c3? I mean, first of all, if you're affiliated with a charity, it might be a good idea to just take a quick look and make sure everything's okay. Occasionally I'll run into a charity where they've not been tax exempt for several years because they quit filing their 990s and nobody really thought about it. Or if you are dealing with another organization, it's always a good idea to check them out and make sure they're a 501c3. If you're going to make a contribution, if you're going to make a grant, or even if you're just sort of entering into a joint project with another organization, it's good to verify that they're a 501c3. So the easiest way to do that, and the most certain way of doing that, is to verify with the IRS online. I put the URL of the website there. There used to be a book that they published called Publication 78. Publication 78 looked like a phone book for someplace about the size of Sylvania. It wasn't as big as the Toledo phone book, but it was a pretty good size book. And it listed the names of every organization that was a charity. And you could go to the library and find that. Well, thankfully, in the digital age, they update it pretty regularly. The last time I looked, it was updated within the past 2 weeks. And if you see an organization listed here, according to IRS records, it's a charity, and you can rely on that. And if they lose their status, IRS takes them off the list, or sometimes it'll make a notation stating if there's a problem. The second item is what I generally see organizations do a lot: ask for an exemption letter. So you can ask them to give you a copy of their exemption letter, and that's certainly helpful, but that's not conclusive. An organization could have an exemption letter, could fail to file its 990s for several years, or could be audited and lose its exempt status. That letter is a historical document. It doesn't necessarily prove that you have current 501c3 status. But if you have an exemption letter, make sure you hold on to it, because if you sometimes to open a bank account, certainly to get a grant, or the other party will want to see your exemption letter. But as I said, that's not conclusive. So the third point, grants, some other programs require 501c3 status. If you're, sometimes there's a federal grant that requires the recipients to be 501c3s, and then the sub-grantors. So I have a client that's a charity that receives federal funding, and everybody they deal with has to be a 501c3. So we need to make sure that they're all covered. The fourth point, another thing you can do is look it up at GuideStar. GuideStar is a nonprofit website, and they publish public information on, in theory, every charity. It's not entirely complete, but it's pretty complete. There you can browse on GuideStar without an account. There's a free version that gives you additional information, and then there's a paid version that allows you to dive deeper than that. But if you've never been to GuideStar, take a look. maybe consider signing up for a free account if you like. On there, you can often find copies of the 990s, the information returns for other charities. Sometimes they'll have, I don't know, 3, 6, 8 years worth. The 990s are there because when you submit a 990, it becomes public information. It gets published. GuideStar must get the copies from IRS, and then they publish them online. So GuideStar is useful. It's not conclusive proof that another organization is currently a 501c3. No, it's helpful evidence. It's not conclusive proof. But one thing that's cool about GuideStar is you can see what other organizations are doing, whether they're competitors or just other, role model organizations. You can look up other organizations, and you can get all the information on there in the 990s. So you can benchmark yourself against other organizations. You can just see how other people are doing them, doing their activities, and that can be useful. The last link there is to the Ohio Attorney General. The Ohio Attorney General has a charitable trust section, and they're in charge of monitoring and enforcing charitable trusts, which includes things that aren't trusts. So a 501c3 is often a charitable trust. There's a definition of what's a charitable trust and what's not, and it's a little more complicated than just whether you're 501c3 or not. It's a little narrower in some respects, but it's also broader in some respects. So if you're a charitable trust, you have to register with the Ohio Attorney General, submit information typically online. But if you are a member of the public or another charity, you can look up other charities online, see if they're registered and what information they have posted. In addition to we'll talk a little bit more about charitable trust registration in a bit. So this is a sample exemption letter. If you're involved with a 501c3, you may have already seen one, but this is a sample from, let's see, this is from 2002, so this is about 18 years old. They look a little bit different right now. In the old days, the exemption letter included a preliminary ruling, an advance ruling they called it, as to whether you were a public charity or not. And then when you filed your 990s for several years, they would decide sort of retroactively whether you really were a public charity or whether to reclassify you as a private foundation. That advanced ruling process doesn't exist anymore. But if you see an exemption letter, it'll look something like this. Do charities need to be corporations? Well, no, they really don't. That's the most common way to start a charity is to use an Ohio nonprofit corporation in Ohio. It's usually the best choice because it's the best trod path. It's fairly clear how to use an Ohio nonprofit corporation for a charity in Ohio. I'll take a break here for a second and say most of my citations here are to the Ohio Revised Code. We're assuming most of the audience will be in Ohio. Most of what I say here today will apply not just to Ohio, but generally to other states. But we're broadcasting from Ohio, and that's most of our audience. So those seem to be the most relevant citations. So the most common is a nonprofit corporation. That's Chapter 1702 of the Ohio Revised Code. There's also something called a nonprofit limited liability company. Ohio Revised Code Chapter 1785 is the limited liability company statute, and they sort of tacked on a little bit about nonprofit LLCs. Nonprofit LLCs are pretty complicated. If you were going to start a charity, I wouldn't just jump to the nonprofit LLC, and you probably need help if you want to use one of those. It's a nice tool in certain circumstances, but it's certainly not a one-size-fits-all. Next is trusts. Some nonprofit organizations that are charities are actually trusts where they have a trustee, And that's a lot less common now, but you can form a 501c3 that is a trust. I prefer using a nonprofit corporation because the duties of a trustee are, I guess directors in a corporation have fiduciary duties, trustees have fiduciary duties, but there are probably greater limits on the responsibility of directors of a nonprofit corporation than for a trustee of a trust. So it's probably safer to use a nonprofit corporation. Plus, as I said, that's the well-trod path, and there are plenty of resources for using a nonprofit corporation. Finally, a nonprofit association. I came across one of those recently where people just got together, decided to be a nonprofit, and they did not incorporate. That's possible. You can have an unincorporated association that's a charity. It can get 501c3 recognition. The only problem is there's no corporation. As you know, a corporation offers limited liability, so the people involved with the corporation are not necessarily personally liable for all of the debts. With an association, it's a lot less clear. So there's a greater risk of liability for people associated with an association than certainly members of a corporation. So I shy away from using associations. The couple times I've seen them, we've converted them to a corporation, but it is possible. So to conclude on that question, charities don't need to be corporations. They usually are, but you can find other types of organizations that are charities. So who owns a charity? That may sound like a silly question, but I've seen a surprising number of answers over the years. Do the founders own the charity? Well, no, the founders don't own the charity. Some founders feel, the founders certainly feel a sense of pride, a sense of accomplishment, and that's all valid, but they don't own the charity. It doesn't belong to them. They can't treat it like it's their own property. Does the membership own a charity? Well, again, no, not really. In a nonprofit that's not a charity, let's go back to the country club that's a nonprofit, but it's not a charity. The members do own the country club. But the members don't own the charity. If a charity has members, the members can't decide to split up the assets among themselves. Do the directors own a charity? Well, in many charities, the directors control it, but they don't own it. They have fiduciary duties toward the charity. So that then you might think, well, they're kind of assets dedicated to the public for charitable purposes. Does the public own the charity? Well, no, the public doesn't own the charity because the public can't just come in and demand its share of the assets or something. The government doesn't own it either. It's not a government organization. The government has regulatory authority. So ultimately, nobody owns the charity. So that brings there was the story of the tragedy of the commons back in medieval Europe. They had a common area where everybody could graze their sheep. It was considered, nobody owned it. Those areas tended to get overgrazed. So if nobody owns something, if property is private property and it has an owner, the owner usually takes care of it. So since nobody really owns it, the laws were set up to protect charities from abuse. So the laws that make directors responsible, that gives the government oversight authority, this all reflects the fact that nobody owns a charity. So it's kind of unique in our mostly capitalist society to have property that nobody owns. So what special laws govern charities? There are three independent hierarchies here. And they're all independent. So while federal law generally trumps state law and state law trumps the governing documents, you still have to comply with all three of these hierarchies. It's not a defense to say I complied with the Internal Revenue Code if you violated the Ohio Nonprofit Corporation Law or didn't follow your own internal documents. So consider these independent hierarchies, and then within each hierarchy, they're listed in rough order of precedence. So for federal law, the Internal Revenue Code governs charities, Treasury regulations, revenue rulings, and then sort of general federal laws. If there's, certainly federal laws against Medicare fraud, for example, apply to charitable health organizations just as they would to anybody else. Under state law, the preeminent law is the Ohio Nonprofit Corporation Law, Chapter 1702. There is also an Ohio Charitable Trust Law. As I said, that gives the Attorney General authority to require charities to register and file information each year. The Ohio Charitable Solicitations Law governs people who solicit charitable contributions. This applies not just to charities, but also to professional fundraisers. I won't get into exactly who's a professional fundraiser right now, but there are organizations. When you get the call saying that they're from the Police Patrolmen's Association, that guy with the gravelly voice in some boiler room somewhere, that organization is supposed to be registered with the state of Ohio to do charitable solicitations. Next is the really unfortunate acronym because it doesn't spell anything, the UPMIFA, Uniform Prudent Management of Institutional Funds Act. Very generally what that says is if you get a restricted gift, if you get a gift for a particular purpose, you have to segregate that from other funds on your books at least, and only spend it for that purpose. When I say segregate the funds, it can be this in the same bank account, but on the balance sheet, it needs to have a separate account. It'll often say, restricted funds, earmarked funds. So if you get a donation, if you are, a school boosters association and you get donations for new soccer goals, you put that money aside and you need to spend it for new soccer goals. You can't spend it on the banquet for the players, for example. There are some organizations that have multiple pots of money that is dedicated to certain things. One reason this can be important is if you're doing a fundraiser, you should be rather specific in saying what the money is for. If you say the money is going to a particular purpose, it needs to be spent for that particular purpose. Sometimes I've seen fundraisers where it says what they're going to spend the money on, but it says, if we have extra money, we can use it for this other purpose, or it'll say it'll be used for this purpose, but if for some reason we can't accomplish that, we'll do something else. And you're thinking, well, who would ever know if we spend it for something different? It's not, IRS doesn't really monitor this, but the state attorney general's office can and sometimes does. For $100, they probably wouldn't bother. But if you were, collecting money for a new stadium and then you wound up spending it on salaries, it's a lot of money. The attorney general's office could look into it. Usually, one of the donors would complain, and the attorney general's office might look into that. Then finally, the same state laws that apply to everybody else generally apply to nonprofits. And finally, the third hierarchy on the right, the Articles of Incorporation are the preeminent internal governing document. Those are filed with the Ohio Secretary of State's office. The second is the Code of Regulations. Outside Ohio, they usually call those bylaws, but it's basically the same thing. And those are the internal rules when you have meetings, whether you have members or not, who has a vote. So those govern the internal operation of the organization. Those can be enforceable in court if necessary. Courts don't like to get involved in charities, but there have been cases where they have. Then finally, policies and procedures. If you have policies and procedures, you need to follow them. Those can be enforceable against the organization. So the takeaway there is to have very strict ambitious policies sounds like a good idea until you get hit over the head with them. You should have policies that you can live with, policies that are achievable, rather than try to set a really ambitious goal with a policy you can't necessarily live up to. So charities have a number of different reporting requirements. Under federal law, to form the organization, you have to file Form 1023. In terms of annual returns, they don't really file tax returns, so they call them information returns. The Form 990 or the 990-PF. Private foundations have to file a 990-PF, which is a little more involved and has some stricter questions, and also involves a small tax. If your organization has gross receipts under $200,000 per year and has assets of less than $500,000, you can file the 990-EZ. As you might gather, the EZ is a little easier than the normal Form 990. If you have gross receipts under $50,000, you need to file the Form 990-N. N, I think, just stands for notice. When they came out with this requirement, they started calling it the e-postcard. Essentially, you log on and you send a little message to IRS saying, hey, we're still alive. We have gross receipts under $50,000, so we don't have to report anything, but we're still alive. Schedule A is the schedule to the 990 that 501c3 organizations have to fill out. All or many types of organizations that are nonprofit file a 990. It's not just charities, so the Schedule A is something specific to charities. Under state law, if your organization is a charitable trust, it's required to register as a charitable trust and file an annual report. Typically that can be submitted online, and I think that typically just involves uploading a copy of the federal 990. I think there's a way around it if you don't file a 990, say if you're in the 990N category, but you typically just upload something once a year. There's a fairly modest filing fee depending on the level of assets of the organization. Charitable solicitation, if you're soliciting funds from the general public, again, the rules are a lot more complicated than that, but that's the general concept. If you're soliciting funds from the general public, you need to register as a charitable solicitor. And so there's an additional registration and reporting and fee. State tax filings, if you have unrelated business income, there can be other if you own real estate and there's not an exemption. So there's some circumstances where you would need to make state tax filings, possibly if you are running a store sales tax. So there are some circumstances where you make state tax filings. In terms of meetings, these are not filed with any government organization, but if there are members, there should be an annual meeting of members. If there are directors, there needs to be an annual meeting of directors, regular and special meetings. So which documents are public? The public documents include the Articles of Incorporation, which are filed with the Ohio Secretary of State, the Form 1023, which you can get from IRS with a FOIA, Freedom of Information Act request, or you might find it on GuideStar. Form 990s, same thing, and the Estate Attorney General filings, the charitable trust and charitable solicitation registrations. Those are all public documents. The non-public documents generally include the Code of Regulations, board resolutions, internal documents. I put an asterisk there because there are exceptions. There are some organizations that fall under the Ohio Open Records Law. Probably not most charities, but sometimes that can happen. Certainly they could be discoverable if there's litigation, but those are not documents that are routinely published. So they're not necessarily secret, but they're not public. So we were talking about public charities and private foundations. What's a public charity? A public charity is a nonprofit that, or a 501c3 in particular, that meets a public support test. If it doesn't meet the public support test, it's a private foundation. Now, if you look inside in the Internal Revenue Code, they never use the term public charity. They use the term private foundation and then an organization that's not a private foundation. That's confusing. So we call them public charities if they meet the public support test. So public charity, a 501c3 is either a public charity or a private foundation. So what are the disadvantages of a private foundation? First of all, a private foundation has to file an additional tax schedule, the 990PF, with its annual 990 return. As I mentioned, there was a modest tax. It's a 2% excise tax on net investment income. So obviously things like income and interest and dividends are taxed at 2%. Some other passive investment income is as well. That's not a very large tax, but it's a tax that a public charity doesn't have to pay. Private foundations have to expend at least 5% of their assets annually. That can be grants to other organizations, or it could be program expenses. For example, carrying out educational seminars or carrying out their business. So they're required to spend 5% of their assets annually. There are also strict prohibited transaction rules that apply only to private foundations against self-dealing. In the companion presentation that we did to this, we talked about conflicts of interest. For a public charity, conflicts of interest are important because you have to avoid private inurement. If there's a conflict, the conflict has to be managed. Some conflicts have to be avoided, some have to be managed. But there's some discretion, and there are some self-interested transactions that could be allowed. With a private foundation, it's a strict prohibition, and there is a penalty if you engage in one of those, whether it benefits the organization or not. I had a client early in my career who had a private foundation that was short of cash, so he made a 0% interest loan to the private foundation, and a few months later paid himself back. He was not happy when I told him that was a prohibited transaction and we had best disclose that and pay the penalty. He ultimately did because we had to, but it was, the point is he did something that was selfless. He loaned money at 0% to the charity and got paid back, but that was a prohibited transaction, and that was against the law for a private foundation. For a public charity, it would have probably been okay. He didn't really benefit from it. So I talked about the public support test. There are essentially 3 tests. The first one is if you get more than a third of your support from the general public. And when we talk about the general public, if anybody gives you more than 2% of your support, you only count the 2% and you ignore the rest. So in theory, you could have, let's see, if you had 17 supporters and you got 2% of your revenue from each of them, you would be at 34%. So that would qualify. If you have 2 giant supporters who give you all of your revenue, each of them would only count for 2%. So you would only have 4% public support. So that would not qualify. So the public support test, the idea behind it is that if you have a lot of different donors, then you're going to probably be more accountable to them. If you have 1 or 2 donors, they might be calling the shots and you're not really operating in the public interest. 509A2 is for organizations that carry on kind of a nonprofit business or a program that's where they take in revenue. So say, for example, an adoption agency. The adoption agency collects fees for its services and may also take donations as well. But most of the revenue is coming from services. So in that case, The gross receipts from the exempt activity would include the adoption receipts. So rather than just looking at charitable contributions, you would look at the receipts from the receipts from the adoption fees, and if those were more than a third, you meet the public support test. But for the A2 test, you cannot have more than a third of your support from investment income or unrelated business taxable income. We'll talk about UBTI in a moment, but if you've got a huge endowment and you're getting half of your revenue from that endowment, then you can't meet the 509A2 test. You would have to make the one of the other tests work. 509A3 is a supporting organization. It's an organization that's basically dedicated to another charity. So it counts as a public charity if it's dedicated to another public charity. So here are some of the taxes that charities have to pay and don't have to pay. You're exempt from federal income tax unless you have unrelated business taxable income. Same with the Ohio CAT tax. You are completely exempt from Ohio sales tax on things you purchase. You are exempt from Ohio sales tax on your sales, provided you have 6 or fewer days of taxable sales in a year. So if you have an annual fundraiser and you're selling things then, that would be okay. If you operate a little store, there's a case I'm aware of that involved a store that sold, I think it was Girl Scout uniforms, and it was open every day. And they had to charge sales tax because they were open more than 6 days a year. The theory is, if you're only selling 4 or 5 days a year, you're not really competing against local businesses. But if you're open every day, you need to charge sales tax because you're competing with other local businesses that have to charge it. The Ohio real property tax, you're exempt if it's charitable use property, but that's kind of a complicated question. It's not automatic, so that's why the asterisk is there. You're exempt from federal unemployment tax, but you're subject to every other type of payroll tax that's out there. I put some items in red because directors and officers are personally liable if those are unpaid, or can be. So you don't want to take that risk. If you're a director or officer, you should make sure that those get paid no matter what. A little bit on UBTI, unrelated business taxable income. So that's income from an unrelated trade or business. A trade or business is essentially something that might compete with another business. It's something that you carry on regularly, and it's a business that it's a business similar to what other businesses might do, and it's not related to your exempt function. So the classic case, you see the Muller's Spaghetti logo. Someone donated the Muller's Spaghetti factory to New York University maybe 60, 80 years ago, and there's a famous case. NYU was not paying tax on any of that income, and the famous case said, now, wait a minute, if you own a spaghetti factory, you're competing with other spaghetti factories. If you don't have to pay income tax on that income, then it's not a level playing field. So that case brought in the concept of unrelated business income before the Internal Revenue Code did, and it basically said, if it's not related to your exempt function, you still have to pay income tax. So if you have UBTI, you have to file a Schedule 990T with your annual return, and you have to pay tax at normal corporate income tax rates. So before you get too afraid about UBTI, what is not UBTI? Well, any passive income is not a trade or business. Interest, dividends, rents, royalties, those are passive, so it's not a trade or business, so it's not UBTI. If it's infrequent activity, for example, if you have an annual event, and you're running a lemonade stand once a year and you sell a lot of lemonade, that's not UBTI, because even if it's not connected to your function, it's a fundraiser. It's not a regular event. It's not a trade or business because you don't carry it out regularly. The third major exception is volunteers. If you have an enterprise that could be a business, but all the labor is by unpaid volunteers. And I mean, you do not have your executive director check in on them and help manage it. You want to be very strict if you're going to rely on this exception. So if all the labor is by unpaid volunteers, it's not a trade or business. And then finally, if it's just not a trade or business, that's kind of a general exception. So we've covered a lot of different topics here. They've been kind of metaphysical, so I hope they were interesting and helpful. If anyone has any questions, please fire away. Heather will be collecting the questions and relaying them to me.
Yes, so thank you, Craig. We do have some questions here. So from one of the participants, what do you suggest if we think our organization should have been registered to a different 501c classification?
That can be fixed. I just finished a case involving something like that recently, where they called themselves a 501c3, but they were not acting as a 501c3. They really should have been a C6, a trade association. So what I did is I formed another organization, and we basically started another organization from scratch, and we assigned the assets from the old one to the new one, and we killed off the old organization. So it's that's the general plan. It's you know, the devil's in the details, but that's the general landscape of how we did that.
So it sounds like it's not a catastrophe. It's more some paperwork, maybe a fee and some filings.
Yeah, the problem is not how to do that. The problem would be mostly what are the consequences if you were under the wrong classification. For example, if you weren't a charity and you were holding yourself out as a charity, that could cause some real complications. But just converting from one type of an organization to another can be done. It's harder to go from C3 to something else because the C3 assets are generally dedicated to charity. But it's, you know, it can be tricky, but it can be done.
So reading between the lines, I'm going to say something, fix it if it's not right. So if a group was operating as a 501c3 and taking charitable contributions, but they weren't a 501c3, that would be taxable income. Is that what you're saying?
It could be. I mean, if
Yeah.
Ultimately IRS makes that decision.
Mm-hmm.
And the problem would be if you're holding yourself out as a 501c3, but you never were, then you might still, that income might still be exempt if you are, for example, a 501c4, or it could still be exempt, but the people who donated the money wouldn't get a tax deduction. So there's a question. I mean, if the people knew what they were doing and did it anyway, they could be committing fraud by soliciting charitable contributions that are not charitable. So that's why I say it can be dicey, but and the other thing is if it really was a C3 and it just wants to transfer to another type of organization, it may not be able to take its assets with it.
Right.
Because the assets that it has have been dedicated to 501c3 purposes.
Mm-hmm.
So it's complicated, but it's you know, it's better to fix things.
Right.
You don't want to have a situation that's dysfunctional and let it go on. If you voluntarily fix it before IRS or the Attorney General find you, it's generally a lot easier to clean up than if you get audited and they find that things have been done improperly. Then that's when there can be sanctions, and it's a much bigger problem if they catch you than if you try to fix it yourself.
Yeah, and better yet, if there are people listening who are considering starting a 501c3, best to get probably some type of legal opinion as to whether really determine what is the best classification before you even register anything.
Yeah, that's a good point. There are when people form a 501c3, a lot of people who want to form a 501c3 probably should not be forming a 501c3, and I'm not casting any judgment on the people involved. I'm just saying that there may be other ways to accomplish your goal that involve a lot less administration and hassle and filing fees. So there's a lot of people just have an idea like, oh, we should form our own charity, but there's a lot of responsibility. There's, care and feeding, if you will, of a charity. So it's always best to get some good advice before you rush off and file those articles.
So I'm not sure whether you're going to have something to add, because this is a related question. How easy is it to partner with an existing nonprofit versus starting a new nonprofit?
No, that's a great question. When somebody comes in and they ask to start a nonprofit, one of the areas I usually explore with them is there another nonprofit that's already out there that you could partner with, either as a volunteer? There are, it's new but possible to sort of set up a division or a subsidiary under a nonprofit where you could even have some autonomy. I've done that a few times before. But if you use an existing nonprofit and you're willing to work with them, they're willing to work with you. That way you're not adding another layer of administration. If they're already filing all of the 990s and handling all of that, most people who want to help do something for charity, they don't want to sit in the back room with the computer and fill out the 990 forms. They want to be out doing good. So unless you've got a real administrative bent, it's probably a good idea to find an existing charity and pair up with them.
Great. So for those who, another question, for those who want to start a 501c3, what are the steps involved?
Well, I think this could be the topic of another presentation. I'll have to talk to Heather about this afterwards.
So one thing that I can offer from the center is that we do have a starting a nonprofit page on our website at c4npr.org. And essentially, and I guess you're going to tell me, Craig, if this needs to be adjusted, we tell people it's really a minimum of 4 steps. So one is forming their legal entity through the Secretary of State, and then getting an EIN number, and then going through the process of filing the 1023 with the IRS for 501c3 status, and then finally registering their nonprofit with the Ohio Attorney General's office. I mean, obviously there's other logistics things like bank accounts, et cetera, but to actually get their letter of determination, that's what they call it, this letter that you can wave around, that's the official anointing of your nonprofit. And there's lots of great resources out on that page, some video training. And of course, Craig, you point to what I think is really the first step, is the research of what's already being done out there and how can we avoid duplication.
Yeah, that's true. Another thing that charity will need if it's a nonprofit corporation is the code of regulations. In theory, you don't need a code of regulations because the nonprofit corporation statute has default rules. It'll say if this is the rule that applies unless the code of regulations says otherwise. But the default rules are supposed to be a one size fits all, and one size never fits all. So you want a code of regulations that sets forth when you have meetings, how people vote. It's just a lot more convenient to have that. And when you open your bank account, they're going to ask for the articles in the code of regulations. And it's a lot easier to say, here it is, than to say, well, we don't have one. We're just relying on the statute.
Right. So one final question that we have, somebody would like to know, how many charities are there in the Toledo area? Do you happen to know that, Craig?
Oh, I do not. I've seen that figure, but it's been a while.
Can we agree that it's lots? There's lots and lots of them?
I would say easily more than 1,000.
Okay, so I happen to be very interested and passionate in this area, and we did some research through the center because we couldn't answer that question. So as of 12/31 in 2018, because there's always a lag in reporting, we're waiting for the numbers to come out for 2019. In Lucas, Wood, and Fulton counties, which is defined as Metro Toledo, there are 3,472 501c3 organizations. Isn't that incredible?
That doesn't surprise me.
Yeah, and in 2018 alone, there were 156 new 501c3s that came online in our community. So I just think that really puts into perspective anyone, there's a reason why I live in Toledo. It's a loving, giving, caring community. We all want to help each other. I mean, that's so evident right now. If someone's listening to this webinar much later, we're just really at the beginning of the coronavirus. And that's why I live here. And a lot of people want to help, and they think that starting another nonprofit is the best way to do that. And I would invite people to step back and do the research and really ask the question, is that really the best way to accomplish the goals that you want to accomplish for your community? Because as you said, Craig, correctly, someone has to be in that back room doing the QuickBooks and making sure that you maintain your 501c3 status and running the board and all the other things that are not frontline service. So yeah, I would just invite people to make sure they do their research before they start yet another nonprofit.
Yeah, I like to tell the puppy story when I meet with a new client and they want to start a charity. I said that right now you want to go out and help people, and that's the puppy you want to bring home. This cute puppy with big paws, and you just want to take him home and play with him and make him feel good and take care of him. But what you don't think about when you get a puppy is all the vet bills, go out cleaning out the yard. There's a lot of responsibilities when you get a new puppy, and sometimes people don't think of those responsibilities. They just think of the how they want to take care of a puppy and the good feelings they're going to have. So if you partner with another charity, if you find the right partner and if the personalities work out, which isn't always the case, then you can basically contract out the yard pickup and the vet bills, and you get to pet the puppy, which is what you really want to do.
That's a great analogy, Craig. I'm going to have to remember that one. So I'm just noticing the time, and we coincided with that was our last question. So I want to thank you for participating in today's webinar, and a very special thank you to Craig for sharing his time and experience with all of you. And again, a big thank you to the Toledo Bar Association for their continued collaboration to make these webinars possible. As a reminder, a copy of the slides will be sent to you after the webinar. The last slide includes resources available through the center related to this topic. This webinar is being recorded, and a replay link will be emailed to you within 24 to 48 hours. To learn more about other opportunities such as this one, we invite you to visit c4npr.org, and we hope to connect with you soon.